Bom dia a todos. É um prazer muito grande estar aqui nessa mesa com o professor Bryan Garth. Nós somos defensores públicos e, para nós, o livro dele é a nossa Bíblia, como meu colega aqui bem falou, porque foi a origem de tudo, né? A origem da defensoria pública foi como o acesso à justiça foi pensado, a primeira onda de acesso à justiça. E nós estamos aqui hoje nos 27 estados da federação hoje porque se pensou nesse modelo público de defensoria pública no Brasil. É um orgulho muito grande poder apresentar aqui o professor Bryan Garth. Welcome, and let's have a good pleasure.
So I want to start by saying how I'm going to proceed here. I'm going to talk for a while. I will occasionally have questions for you, and it will be great if you try to respond to them. I know this is not the perfect seminar room, but I want you to have courage and speak, especially as you react to what I say. I have to start a little bit autobiographical because my own story is so linked up with the theme of access to justice. My very first job after law school was in Florence, working on a Ford Foundation project called Access to Justice. I was started as a very low research assistant, but somehow, in the context of things, I became the co-author of the general report and of other things there. So, as you all probably know, the Florence Project had the idea of three ways of access to justice. Legal aid, representing the poor, representing collective and diffuse interest through public interest law and class actions. And then the third was a kind of alternative dispute resolution, but also a kind of a rethinking of all the ways that we can make rights effective. We proclaimed in the first version of the general report that this was a worldwide movement to make rights effective and enforce the rights of the disadvantaged and give them the rights that would allow them to improve their lives. The idea was to help the have-nots, not so much the haves. Well, it was a great idea, but it almost disappeared after we published the volume. Neoliberalism came, the worldwide movement became not a worldwide movement. However, Brazil kept it alive in many respects. You had this translation, very fortunately, by Ellen Gracie Northfleet. So you had the text there in Portuguese at exactly the time of the 1988 Constitution. You created the Defensores Públicos, who are the embodiment of access to justice here in Brazil. But there was not much going on in the name of access to justice in any other places, it seemed to me. Now, curiously, access to justice is back on the reform agenda. Indeed, after many years, I've lent my name and some help to an access to justice project emanating here from Rio, from the Defensores Públicos. So it's back on the agenda. It's clear, like from the United Nations, the UNDP, from the activity of the philanthropic foundations in the United States. And even though this is a kind of a strange piece of evidence, the fact that the MacArthur Foundation gave one of its Genius Awards to Rebecca Sandifer, a sociologist who tried desperately to keep access to justice on the agenda, was denied tenure at Stanford for writing on access to justice, and then she received a MacArthur $1 Million Genius Award. That shows that the context has changed and that it's a positive development for the access to justice agenda. So my question today, the theme of my talk, is what does it mean to speak of access to justice as a program today of legal and social reform? And as a research project, what are the challenges and limitations in this particular period, which is a period of much greater inequality than we had in the 1970s, both globally and in the United States and other particular countries. So the way I've decided to proceed is I picked 5 recent articles to talk about these issues, to talk about them critically. They are diverse, but I think, and you will decide if I am right, that together they present a kind of an interesting perspective on the issues that we have today. What I'm not going to do, and these articles don't do, and what I used to do sometimes, is talk critically about design issues in the law, mediation versus arbitration versus negotiation. I'm happy to talk about that, but that's not going to be what I present in this talk. So the first question, which is very general and maybe too general, is before I start talking, what's kind of the sense of access to justice as a framework for research and reform? Would anybody in the audience like to take up that question now, at the start? I will wait for a second, but not much longer. Okay, I haven't given you enough, and you're too nervous right now. And if I were you in the audience there, my hand would not go up. I would have been too nervous as well. It's easier up here to talk. Okay, I want to start with first a kind of self-criticism of the Access to Justice Project, and that's the first article that I posted. It's why did we have a distinction between civil access to justice and criminal access to justice? And this matters especially in the place that I know best, of course, the United States. So I assigned a reading, or I posted a reading by a professor at my own law school, Sasha Natapov. And she writes about misdemeanors. These are small crimes where you're not supposed to be punished by time in jail or in prison. They are things like loitering, which is just standing there in a place where somebody doesn't want you to be. Or trespassing, which is standing in a place where somebody else owns it. Or minor drug offenses. Or traffic offenses. And especially minorities in the United States, they get caught in a place through this misdemeanor system where they had one accident, they were picked up for loitering because a policeman didn't like their look, they are taken, arrested, they receive a public defender who has thousands, literally in many cases, who meets them, this is the standard line, meets them, greets them, and then pleads them guilty, all in one quick moment. But they are only put on probation, except what happens is they have the stain of the conviction, then they have problems in probation, there might be a fine, like a traffic offense, that they don't pay, and they get deeper and deeper into trouble. All for kind of nothing. So there is a particular issue about criminal justice and access to justice, and minorities especially, because prejudice is where you see those kinds of arrests that proliferate. And it's a very informal justice in the worst possible way. So my second question, which you all have perspective on, is, are there similarities at all in Brazil to this kind of behavior? I see nodding heads. I'm not so surprised. But so we want to remember whatever else you take away, if you're thinking access to justice, and actually the Rio Project also includes criminal as well as civil concerns. So the second reading that I picked is on access to justice in Brazil. It's written by 3 authors, Gabe, Da Costa, and Asperti. All of them are at FGV, Fundación de Julio Vargas, in Sao Paulo. These are outstanding scholars. And they have a particular thesis. They talk about the Florence Project, but they say that since 1988 they see as the kind of the high water mark of the power of access to justice rhetoric in Brazil, talking of the social right of access to justice. There was also reform of class actions, not exactly full-on, private class actions, but class actions that embody very much the spirit of, we'll say, 88 and access to justice. But later, this is the point of their article, later they say, you still hear the rhetoric of access to justice, but it's very different. So, in later iterations of these reforms, they might talk about third wave, alternative dispute resolution, but what was in mind was not making rights effective so much, but was efficiency, speed, eliminate cases from the courts. So it was a different kind of talk. And what they say is this was a kind of retreat that they say has not been really noted as much as it should by the scholarly community in Brazil. So what's the remedy for this rhetoric being used, we'll say, wrongly about access to justice? For them, they call for a kind of new politics of law. That is, when you talk about access to justice, don't just talk about efficiency and speed, but talk about redistribution. What does it take for a have-not to win against the haves and claim rights, whether they are rights to assistance, to housing, to medicine, to many other kinds of things? And they say, in fact, the opposite has occurred, that the reforms have led to advantages for the haves, for those who use the courts frequently to collect debts, to enforce contracts, and the like. So I'm not sure I'll ask for too much on this question, but I want to say, what do you think about that? That's what happened, they say. Okay. The good thing is, I have an answer because I have a thought about this. The question, you could say, is what can you get even from their remedy to turning it into a legal politics? What does a legal politics look like? Is it the OAB, lawyers, professors, and courts? How much power, and this will be a kind of a theme, and I don't mean it as a downer for all of you, but how much power do these groups have in a world of neoliberal economics? Can they separate the access to justice, the programmatic, progressive access to justice movement from the economics and power structure of the day? Now note, this is also what happened in the Florence Access to Justice Project. I've mentioned this before, but not today, but almost nobody noticed. One reviewer noticed in the reviews of Access to Justice that in the third volume of Access to Justice, in the introduction, and these are words that I wrote myself, I can say, we said, the access to justice movement and its opposite look very much alike. Access to justice, informal justice, alternative dispute resolution is just as good at cooling rights as it is at enforcing rights. So that's all I have to say on the first article, which is a kind of critique and a program for access to justice in Brazil that I like, but I'm questioning for the rest of the lecture, how does access to justice coexist with a different political time. So the third article that I want to talk about goes back to the second wave of access to justice on public interest law and class actions. It's written by Fabio de Silva, who is a Brazilian law and society scholar who is actually now teaching in Oklahoma in the United States. And what he set out to do in this article was to compare public interest law in Latin America and public interest law in the United States. Now, I want to say something that's striking about this comparison. When we wrote Access to Justice in the late 1970s, there was no public interest law anywhere but in the United States. So this is a big change. It's now global, as Fabio says. Well, what does that mean? And this is something where I get a little more provocative, but I don't think it should be cause for too much provocation. Public interest law, like corporate law, spread from the United States. There were importers in Latin America, people who had this idea of doing something through law, like human rights, but they also connected to MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, who had their own interests in promoting public interest law around the globe. So it comes in a way out of North-South relations, the rise in prestige of U.S. models toward the end of the Cold War. And so there's a kind of and I don't want to push this too much, but there's a kind of a hegemonic possibility out of this. Now, you can say that that's bad, it's imperial. You can say it's good, it's imperial, if you're in the North. You can say it's good because what public interest lawyers do is good anyway, and we don't care where this idea came from or whether it has any hegemonic possibilities in it. But one thing it does, in a sense, and this is hard to explain, is the export of public interest law is in part facilitated by the fact that we in the United States, because we have been powerful, think that what is universal to us is universal to everybody else. So we naturally think that lawyers should be very strong players in social movements, and we think that public interest law is a natural way to attack social problems. More about that later. Now, what does Fabio de Silva find in his study? He takes for granted, and he's not bothered by the fact that this is a kind of a north-south export-import. And what he finds that is quite interesting is, as it turns out, the U.S., as it has evolved from the 1970s, is much less about social change than it was in the 1970s. Much more about service to clients. In Latin America, he says, there's quite a contrast. There, the lawyers are much more interested in the social impact through law, including impacts that happen even if you lose, through publicity, through mobilization, through kind of campaigns. So, the question he asks is, why is it different? Okay, we could say, many people look and say, well, the world is converging around, models exported from the U.S., corporate law firms, public interest. But here he says, in fact, it's played out very differently. So, what is the theme? Why is it different? Well, he says, in the North, public interest law, from the perspective of those who go into it, is there because law students do not want to be corporate lawyers, which you know is a big career in the United States, the dominant career of the graduates of top law schools. They want to do something different. They want to be helpful. They want to advance social movement, social change, and so they go into public interest law. And this is a very good point he makes. That's the US. Now, he says, what about in the South, in Latin America? Well, he says, the difference there is the enemy is in part legal formalism, positivism, make a place for law and legal discourse at the center of politics. In contrast, what they are fighting is the notion that everything that can be progressive comes from politics, period. So that it's almost fighting for the creation of this kind of legal politics. And I did not think this at the time, but Access to Justice in the Florence Project is also making a claim for the relevance of law and rights and legal strategies in places where it never was relevant. So it's not just for waves, it's for a place of law that may have not been there before. Let's see how I'm doing great. Okay, now this is the more theoretical part of the talk. If you need to go to the bathroom, this might be a good time to do that. This is more abstract, and I could talk more about it. But there is a literature about the competition between capitalism and capitalism. What do we mean by that? That there are different models of capitalism. One is the US model, and the other is the European model. And that they are and have been in global competition with each other. Still are, in fact. The European model is the stronger state role in the economy and the society. But not necessarily a strong role for lawyers in the economy and society. France would be a perfect model of that. The US model that they talk about in this literature is an emphasis on private markets, civil society, private corporations, social entrepreneurs, rather than programmatic initiatives that come from the state. Instead, they come from the bottom, from social entrepreneurs, in a way. And lawyers are very important in the US model. And in a way, the export of neoliberalism, beginning in Chile with the Chicago Boys, and traveling over a good portion of the world, is an attempt to export this US model of governance. Emphasis on privatization, private markets, trade, investment, the Washington Consensus, in a word, which has changed, but is still a kind of a basis of this. And with this came a stronger role for lawyers. Corporate lawyers, they didn't exist before, and now they exist everywhere. And in a way, you could say, public interest law came along with this as a way of privatizing, social reform. And you could say, to be provocative, that both corporate law firms and public interest law firms which come with a stronger role for lawyers, also come as part of a campaign in global competition where the US is trying to make the whole world governed in the same way that the US is governed. Weaker state, stronger markets. Now, should we think about that? Again, we can't do much about that. Those were the hierarchies and power relationships of a particular time. It's a reflection of US power in the 1980s, both soft power and, what you say, hard power. And it does not, again, mean that we should oppose public interest law at all, or access to justice. But for me, it's important to have this context and to see the world largely in what produces these kinds of reforms. Everything is complicated, and you don't have to think about the complications, but I find it helpful sometimes to try to situate this in a particular perspective. You can also say, as I said before, so what? Okay? Maybe that's what happened, but I like where we've gotten. There's progress here. Now I want to complicate that even more with the discussion about the United States, to kind of dive deeper into this US model as it's working in the US. In the US, we have many, many public interest law firms of various kinds and shapes. And they are very active, very present. Something like 20% of our law graduates go into public interest law. There has been a rise since really the late 1990s in pro bono. Pro bono is lawyers providing at basically no fee legal services to those who need it. And who are the main providers of pro bono? They are corporate law firms, because they have the resources, they have pro bono coordinators, they have young associates who are bored to death by the work that they're doing as corporate lawyers, who would like to learn some skills, and they want to do pro bono, and they are there as a kind of an army of potential pro bono lawyers. They collaborate with public interest law firms. It's meant to be a kind of perfect harmony because you have the resources of the public interest law firms, you have the resources of the corporate law firms, and you have the technical skill and commitment of the public interest law firms. It also means that they are financially entangled because the public interest law firms need prestigious lawyers on their board. They need people who will raise funds for them. They need money. And for that reason, they seek alliances with prestigious law firms who will have prestigious lawyers who will be on their boards and give them even more credibility, not necessarily in the activist world, but in the world at large, so they can raise money from other establishment figures. So far, so good. But what it does is it makes them very much in a very close relationship. There are some inefficiencies even that come out of this relationship. A brilliant young sociologist's dissertation that was just finished examined exactly this market and found that all those corporate lawyers, the associates, they want to do public interest law, but they don't know anything. So they find a good case, that is, the public interest law firm finds a good case, hands it to the associate, and the associate says, "What do I do?" it takes the staff of the public interest law firm days and days and days to hold the hand of the associate so that they can actually get a result that works in this particular matter. The associate is happy, but these public interest law firms say, do you know what? We would be so much better if you just gave us the money. We could do it ourselves. Now, it would be wonderful if those associates learned the expertise and then came back and back and back for more cases. But what happens is most of the time, they pick one, they like it, they get busy with something else, and then you have to train another one. So it's a very powerful critique of how this is working out. And you could say more about that as well. This relationship means that public interest law firms, dependent on the money of corporate law firms, is not likely to challenge corporate law firms all that much. It's also not likely, in a way, to provide legal needs, because the associates don't want to do divorces and family matters. They want to do immigration. They want to do death penalty. They want to do civil rights cases. They want to do labor and employment cases. So there's this kind of a mismatch, but there's also, and this is really the point that I want to make, and it's a provocative point, but they are very much in the same social world today. They go, if you want to be a public interest lawyer in a top public interest law firm, you had better go to an elite school. So the corporate lawyers, the rising young politicians, and the public interest lawyers are the same people. They know each other. One group said, I don't want to represent corporations, I want to represent people. And another said, I want to get filthy rich. But somehow they coexist. They share the worldview, because the corporate lawyers really have some of their self-image that they are doing this pro bono help. So again, there is this tilt toward corporate power. Not surprising, but it raises the question for the United States, at least, how much does this coalition have a chance to make social change through law? That explains why I picked the next article, which is 4 out of 5. So we're getting there toward the conclusion. And I've given up on the questions, but you better have some questions afterwards. Otherwise, we'll have to have a long coffee break, where the questions might come easier, actually. So the next article is by 2 Israeli-American professors, Ahmad and Barcelona. And this is particularly interesting if we see this kind of U.S. model, in a way. How does it play out? How might it play out? And Brazil has not turned into the U.S. model. No place outside the U.S., except maybe Israel, has emulated the U.S. model so well. Why Israel? Because everybody has been educated in the United States, including the judges. So it's the most legalized place you might find. Law, legal rights, legal discourse is everywhere. There are law-led NGOs. You have a relatively activist, at least until recently, Supreme Court that can take controversial decisions, pro-Palestinian rights, for example. And again, you have this legalistic discourse. So what did the authors do in Israel? They asked, what happened in the biggest mass protest in Israel ever, which happened in 2011, beginning in Tel Aviv, but spreading around Israel? they had a tent city. So people said, I can't afford housing. It's gotten way too expensive. It's a function of neoliberal politics. We have to fight this. So I'm going to make my own house in downtown Tel Aviv, and I invite everybody else to come. And they had huge, they said the biggest demonstrations since 1968, the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. So they asked the question, in the most legalized place, Israel, where was law and where were lawyers? With all these lawyer NGOs, where were they in this really big challenge to political and economic orientation of the day? And what did they find? They found that, in fact, law and lawyers were absent, almost completely absent. Was that because lawyers had no sympathy for this? Not at all. There were some lawyers who participated at very low levels. But the reason was those who were in the movement, which was relatively spontaneous, but was led by kind of journalist types, they said law is part of the Israeli establishment. We've tried to work through law and NGOs, and it has gotten us absolutely nowhere. No thank you, lawyers, is what they said. At the same time, or a little later, the Occupy Wall Street, which became the Occupy movement in the United States, again spread from city to city. Nothing to do with lawyers. And that's also part of this argument. Not so systematic and reasoned. We don't want lawyers, they're too much part of the establishment. But very much the same feeling. So, very provocative, I think. They're saying that even activist public interest law is too much part of a kind of a political, economic establishment. And again, you can say pretty much the same about the United States as a possibility. Now, we could be sad about that, again, but there's more to be said. But I'll start with some more pessimism, too. You could say generally, legal politics, and whatever you think about neoliberal economics, legal politics have not been successful in pushing neoliberal economics anywhere, except maybe for a short time in Colombia. But there's a particular story there that we won't say today. And we shouldn't be surprised. This is moderately upbeat. Lawyers are the custodians of moderate change, of changing social movements into legal avenues. And we could say the same thing. Those who hated the welfare state could not dismantle the welfare state through legal strategies. The attack on the welfare state came from completely outside of and hostile to law. So, is this a problem, or is it as it should be? Well, we are lawyers. We like the law. And we think that law should be relevant in whatever social order we have. We want to keep relevant. The times change. It's so sad to say we change with them. We don't hold strongly to the faith that we had a few decades ago. But we can still say, even if public interest, well, I want to say this a different way. From the perspective of the 1970s, it looked like public interest law, social movements that were law-oriented, were leading social change. If we look backwards into the 1960s and 1970s, when that approach, which we still hear, because public interest law was crafted in that very period when it looked very much like lawyers were leading social change. Looking backwards, those lawyers were swimming in a welfare state where what they did was prized by what we call the liberal establishment, which we now miss, by the way. But lawyers were swimming in the politics of the day. And again, repeating the same point, that politics, of course, leads law. I will have an upbeat conclusion, I promise. Lawyers have agency and relevance, but they are embedded and must exist in the political world. If lawyers are completely opposed to politics, politics neglects lawyers. So my fifth and last article is by the famous Rebecca Sandifer that I named before. And I just picked a kind of a sample of her recent work. It's outstanding work, and I want to say more about it later. But I want also to contrast it with, our beloved Access to Justice movement of the late 1970s. It's very much about how can you measure legal need, when do people really need lawyers, are lawyers better than other providers of legal services, what is the role of technology in helping people who have claims to get the redress that they would like to get. It's about efficiency, recognizing that we operate in a world of cost-benefit analyses. But it is brilliant work that has put something that was not on the agenda, but it's in a completely different context. There is no kind of attack on extreme poverty and disadvantage in this work. And interestingly, I didn't say this, but the way the U.S. evolved with the attack on the welfare state and on the liberal legal establishment, now what we have in the United States is we have a liberal legal establishment and we have a conservative legal establishment. They exist, they fight, but they also went to the same schools and they know each other very, very well. And what can they agree on? They can agree that this access to justice is good. That in extreme inequality days, it's good to have some focus on what remedies are available to ordinary people. It's also relevant in this day of all the reactions to globalization and where middle-class, ordinary people think that they were left out. Maybe this will pull them more into the system, have more faith in our institutions. So it's conservative in that sense, but also progressive in the sense that gives something that might not otherwise have been there. Becky Sandifer does say in this, instead of deciding whether lawyers or self-representation are better in housing courts or in terms of access to health, we could give them housing, we could give them better health. So there's a recognition, but she knows that those are not really on the agenda at the time that she was writing. So the social questions are not much there. And I've kind of painted a picture focused on the United States, but why you would expect that to be the case. But it is fascinating work. You learn a lot about people, their problems, and all of that is extremely useful. So as I near my conclusion, I will offer some minor criticisms, not one major, one minor, of Becky Sandifer on her own terms. Okay, not about the social agenda, but on her own terms. One is that she kept the division between civil and criminal that we've already talked about. I think she should be writing about that as well. The second is a bigger issue and could be the subject of a whole talk, is that when you talk about access to justice, access to individuals who will help resolve claims, listen to your problems, in today's world, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, you need to say access to who? Not just some title, judge, administrative judge, whatever, but who is that person? Who are the judges? Who are the public defenders? Who are the professors? It matters because in this day of polarization around racial, ethnic, gender, etc., it makes a difference if the people that you are talking to resemble you in some way. So that access to justice, okay, I'm still trying to keep it neutral, minimalist in a way, but I think even the technocrats recognize now that there's something to this notion that those who you are trying to learn from, who are taking your case, who are deciding your case, should reflect a broader sense of experiences and ability to empathize. And I think this is becoming, in the United States, even though she doesn't mention it, it is becoming part of the access to justice research agenda on many different issues. And I could talk more about that as well. So, I'm going to conclude. So, obviously, access to justice has changed over time. And I have said that even in the access to justice era, and now in the new access to justice era, and all the stuff in between, legal politics is not enough to get the access to justice job done. And you always, even though this is not about my current research, I have to throw it in here a little bit. Current research is about legal revolutions. And legal revolutions follow social revolutions, and in fact, tend to make them more conservative. But that also keeps them legal. It keeps them respecting rights. So there's a trade-off. People could trade off differently. So the access to justice framework, okay, not where we thought we were bringing, I don't know if any of you will know this, the age of Aquarius into being, but this sort of utopian kind of age of equality didn't come. But the framework that we have now helps a lot of people. It helps, and I should probably emphasize this more, it helps create agendas for politics and other things around social problems, because those who are studying, lack of access reveal deep social problems. And the frame access to justice as such, perhaps, and I think still, is seemingly neutral and maybe gets some allies, some friends, some supporters that you might not otherwise get. So it seems neutral, but of course, how it's used does change over time anyway. But you're keeping law relevant, which is good, and we're waiting for our time when things will get better. So, my last point, completely unrelated in a way, to all the other points. But in a way, I talked critically about, in the US, the alliance of corporate law firms, public interest law firms, and I didn't emphasize it, but I should, elite law schools that reflect a conservative and liberal legal establishment. There are Republicans and Democrats. But, this will be my last cryptic remark, is that when you have someone like Trump in office, our best hope is that legal establishment. So I'll stop there. Now there have to be some questions.
Bom dia, meu nome é Petrônio Calmon, basta. Eu passei 31 anos numa instituição, Ministério Público, e o senhor vem muito ao Brasil e certamente a conhece. Então, em resumo, ao invés de termos escritórios que arrecadam doações, nós temos o próprio Estado financiando um exército de promotores e procuradores que atuam quase sempre contra o próprio Estado. Hoje, o governo atual tem até meia-noite que dominar todo o petróleo que foi jogado na costa do Nordeste brasileiro, porque um juiz deu a ordem ao governo. Governo, governe. É a forma mais fácil de acesso à justiça que eu conheço no mundo. Sou também professor na Itália e tenho conhecimento do sistema europeu e vejo que não há nada mais fácil do que o sistema brasileiro. O Estado paga um agente do Estado para acionar o próprio Estado a governar. A ordem é: governo, governe. Qual é a sua opinião acerca desta situação brasileira em que o Estado atua contra o Estado, em nome da sociedade? A pergunta final é a sua opinião sobre essa situação de que não são pessoas que doam, que fazem doações, mas o próprio Estado financia as ações de interesse público e que quase sempre são dirigidas contra o governo, não contra empresas.
I welcome that particular question because I think one of my perspective, is rooted in the United States in a way. And I recognize the influence of the U.S. in other places, but the state has not been killed in Brazil, and the state has not been killed in France, and in Germany, and other places. And so the notion that the state should play an important role in social problems is still there. And I agree with every Brazilian in your position who thinks this is a remarkable institution that I wish we had. Our public defenders are a very different kind of creature because, of course, they're exclusively defending criminals in criminal matters. And you can take much more initiative. I don't know. I think a good research project would be to explain why this institution has tended to do pretty well in the neoliberal era. And I don't dare say this, but I will say this. But I was talking to a friend who's a defensore about what kinds of things you do. And one of the things you do is, after people have tried forever to get their health benefits, after they have tried forever to get their children into school, you go to the public defender. But that's the worst possible way of getting people into a school or getting them their medicine. So you put your money in the public defender, and you put nothing into schools and medicine. So we all live with our contradictions, I think. Thank you.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Bom dia, professor. Primeiro, obrigada pela sua fala. Eu gostaria de levar a reflexão para um outro lado, uma particularidade aqui nossa do Brasil. Nós temos um Ministério Público, como o colega falou, mas o Ministério Público ele é regido pela autonomia e pela independência de seus membros. Então, o Ministério Público no Brasil escolhe as demandas que ele vai tratar, a não ser na área penal, que ele é obrigado, em outras demandas de direitos sociais, o Ministério Público ele elege se ele vai atuar ou não vai atuar, basicamente. Nós temos a Defensoria Pública, mas a Defensoria Pública ela não abrange todo o território brasileiro, e eu, por exemplo, venho de Goiás, que a Defensoria Pública ela é recente e ela é restrita à capital e à região metropolitana, ela não chega no interior, e isso é a realidade na maioria dos estados brasileiros. E nós temos, a par disso, diferente do modelo americano, a experiência das assessorias jurídicas populares, que são advogados que atuam junto a movimentos sociais e que demandam principalmente em relação a direitos humanos. Mas a reflexão que eu quero provocar, e é uma reflexão que a gente tem tido nesses coletivos de assessoria jurídica popular, é de diante do cenário brasileiro, político, institucional, e principalmente diante da reforma do Código de Processo Civil, que traz um modelo da eficiência, né, da celeridade processual e um modelo de antecedentes, né, que vai colocando de cima para baixo um entendimento, vai consolidando o entendimento de cima para baixo, um questionamento sobre judicializar questões de direitos humanos ou não judicializar questões de direitos humanos. Porque a gente tem tido um posicionamento de retrocesso, de derrotas em relação a esses assuntos no judiciário brasileiro. E muitas vezes, quando nós nos deparamos com determinadas questões, o que nós estamos nos questionando hoje é: judicializamos, acionamos o Estado por meio da Justiça ou não acionamos o Estado por meio da Justiça e buscamos outras alternativas, outros caminhos. E muitas demandas não têm sido judicializadas, primeiro pelo medo desse modelo de antecedentes provocar uma onda de negação e de retrocessos de direitos que já são garantidos. Eu gostaria de colocar essa questão e perguntar para o professor se existem reflexões a respeito disso, né? O professor trouxe a questão de movimentos que rejeitam os advogados, rejeitam, né, diz que não precisamos dos advogados, mas no Brasil hoje nós temos um grupo de advogados, principalmente que lidam com direitos humanos, se questionando se deve acessar o judiciário ou não, e o que isso pode refletir nesse debate sobre acesso à justiça e sobre o próprio direito e papel dos advogados e do direito nessas mudanças sociais. Obrigada.
Well, if I was really smart and had really studied, I could provide you an answer to that question, which is a very, very, very difficult question. But what I would say is you already answered it in the right way, which is that what you have to do is be exactly aware of the differences and debate them. And you won't always get the right way, but you won't always assume that litigation is the right way or that protest is the right way. But you have to be aware and you have to listen, because lawyers are the strongest speakers in the room, usually, and they can shut people down by saying, I have a way here, But it sounds like that's exactly what is not happening there. So for me, this question of legalization or not legalization is a really hard one. It's debated all the time in the US, even though we are so legalized that every single question ends up in the Supreme Court. To me, that's not my ideal of a state, by the way. But every question is in the Supreme Court, where it is handled by the same lawyers on each side, with judges who all went to the same school. And the only thing all those people agree on is that that elite group should decide everything. So legalization is not always the right answer, and you can be over-legalized in a way, and I think we are at this point. There's always, this is just context on me, is those of us in the United States, we long for the stronger state. Whereas those in the strong state say they long for some antidotes to the strong state. So it depends on where you stand, in a way what you're focusing on. But thank you. I'm sorry I can't answer that question.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Meu nome é Débora, sou advogada e também mediadora de conflitos. No início da sua fala, o senhor falou que poderia tratar sobre mediação e outras formas de resolução de conflitos. Eu queria perguntar e pedir uma orientação, um direcionamento ao senhor para quem tem esse interesse de estudar, e de caminhar por esses outros métodos, que não precise acessar o Poder Judiciário para trazer autorresponsabilização, empoderamento, principalmente para as comunidades mais carentes. Essa é uma questão mais teórica. Quero perguntar também sobre prática. Que atores você acredita que sejam interessantes se mobilizarem nessa questão de oferecer outras formas de resolução de conflitos, fora do Poder Judiciário. O Poder Judiciário brasileiro ele trouxe algumas modificações na sua legislação, inclusive especificamente em relação à mediação de conflitos, mas que tentam engessar e colocar dentro de uma forma já pré-determinada esses métodos. Então, eu acredito que seja mais eficiente a gente buscar fora do Poder Judiciário, apesar de trazer mais conhecimento sobre esses institutos para a população brasileira, só que, infelizmente, na prática, ela não está de uma forma tão adequada como o Instituto, a teoria traz. Obrigada.
I think I can say a couple of things to you, at least. The first one is a problem with access to justice thinking or court reform thinking, is you can get away with saying mediation is good, so we're going to create mediation, whereas two mediations by different mediators in different circumstances may have nothing in common except for the basics of mediation. And in the United States, we went to periods of mandatory mediation or mandatory arbitration of claims in front of the courts. And international commercial arbitration, the arbitrators are, the most powerful, learned, established, lawyers around the globe. And so when they do arbitration, it's Rolls-Royce justice. But when the state of Texas creates mandatory arbitration, it's from a bunch of unqualified volunteers who are just interested in doing it for fun. So the question is always, like I said, it's who in many respects. And when you go back to your kind of community empowerment mediation, that takes a lot of resources, a lot of time. And governments are not always interested in creating that time. But it's well worth it. There are many examples of that being very effective. You know, it's bringing people together around an agenda. It's not fighting the state, but it might be kind of a part of it in a sense. But I agree, and I think that's a tragedy of all these words. And this is, you know, my post-access to justice research is all about what's behind the words. A lawyer is not the same in every country. You know, a corporate law firm is not the same. A public interest law firm is not the same. And how do you know they're not the same? You look and see who are the people. Where do they come from? Where are they going? Who are their friends? You know, how respected are they? So, thank you.
Bom dia, meu nome é Érica. Eu queria fazer, obrigada pela aula, professor. Queria fazer uma pergunta, mas pensando no tema da administração da justiça, né, do que a gente costuma chamar aqui de administração da justiça. No Brasil, na última década, algumas organizações de direitos humanos, sobretudo que historicamente têm apostado ou fizeram essa aposta da litigância estratégica, como a colega ali falou antes, do campo da assessoria jurídica popular e da litigância em direitos humanos, ao perceberem na atuação histórica no âmbito do sistema de justiça que, na verdade, existem padrões, digamos assim, de comportamento no judiciário nos diferentes estados, né? Então não importa se é o judiciário aqui do DF, ou do Pará, ou do Rio Grande do Norte, de certa forma, a depender dos sujeitos que estão envolvidos no litígio, e essas organizações atuam em geral com movimentos sociais, há um certo padrão nas decisões, né? Então, algumas organizações na última década no Brasil têm se reunido em torno de articulações de frentes, digamos assim. Então, para citar duas, né, tem a articulação Justiça e Direitos Humanos, a JusDH e o Fórum Justiça. O Fórum Justiça, inclusive, nasceu da Defensoria Pública no Brasil, nasceu na Defensoria Pública do Rio de Janeiro, para tentar pensar em formas de refletir sobre o que chamam de administração da justiça, compreendendo que, de certa forma, deveria existir uma política de justiça no Brasil. Então, questões como os tribunais têm seu orçamento próprio, porque esse orçamento não é participativo, dialogado, porque não existem canais de diálogo com a sociedade para discutir sobre a destinação desse orçamento. Quais são os critérios de indicação de magistrados para serem ministros dos tribunais superiores. No Brasil, a lei orgânica da magistratura nacional, né, a lei que organiza o judiciário brasileiro, ela é da época da ditadura civil-militar. Até hoje, é essa lei que vigora. Então, imagine que há questões, alegados ditatoriais antidemocráticos que perpassam de uma forma muito óbvia e explícita já esse poder. Então, essa articulação tem pensado, na última década, em agendas políticas, em formas de incidência que consigam pensar em democratização do sistema de justiça nessa ótica da administração da justiça. E aí eu queria, pensando em ouvidorias externas, então a Defensoria Pública tem a vanguarda no Brasil em relação a isso, né, de implementar várias defensorias públicas em diferentes estados do Brasil já têm ouvidoria externa, que é uma ouvidoria composta por integrantes da sociedade civil eleitas para comporem ali a administração da defensoria de alguma forma, um canal de diálogo, tá, com a população. E aí eu queria que o senhor falasse um pouco sobre, não sei, nas suas pesquisas ou na experiência nos Estados Unidos, sobre essa pauta da democratização da justiça, pensando nesse viés da administração, né, de experiências exitosas ou não que vocês têm lá, ou eventualmente de pesquisas ou observações em outros lugares também com esse recorte, né, com esse viés, porque entendendo que quando a litigância estratégica tem sido muito discutida no campo dos direitos humanos nesse período mais recente de golpe e de avanço conservador no Brasil, né, fascista, justamente por causa do viés ali que a colega pensou. É muito difícil atuar dentro da institucionalidade desse sistema, sabendo que o direito, historicamente, né, foi criado, inclusive, para a manutenção da ordem, das coisas tais como elas estão, Então, como é que atuando dentro dessa institucionalidade do Estado, dentro desse sistema de justiça, a gente efetivamente vai conseguir promover mudanças, sobretudo porque essa atuação dentro do sistema de justiça ocorre depois que o conflito já existe. Então, ela não se preocupa muito em pensar nas causas que geraram esse conflito e atacar essas causas estruturantes. Então, como é que, acho que esse canal da pensar na democratização da administração da justiça vem como uma possibilidade de tentar pensar nesses problemas mais estruturais. Eu queria ouvi-lo um pouco sobre isso. Obrigado.
Well, I want to start in response to your question by saying to everyone who's asked a question that one of the great things about being here is that I can learn from your questions both interesting things that are happening and have a better sense of this extraordinary place, Brazil. So I thank you for telling me what these thoughts are and what you all are thinking about. And I would say one is that that's a very advanced way of looking at those things from my perspective. In the United States, in my class on legal profession, we bring public interest lawyers into the class, usually a mix of some who started their own and some who have big established public interest law firm positions. And we ask them, how do you relate to the organizations of people that, like immigrants, and that exist in the areas that you work on? How do you relate to the clients that you serve? And they struggle with their answer. They know the right answer is we serve, the people that we're trying to help, and we listen to them, and we take guidance from them. And that the client is the first thing we represent. But then they will tell you, they pick the client for a legal action that they think will be a good one, and they pretty much sell it to the constituencies around it. So the stakeholders who are involved are mostly the lawyers. And that's kind of a function of public interest law in the United States. Not always, but very strongly seen. So I like very much the thinking that you are describing. The one thing I would say, which my talk, had to be about, is that legal politics is a hard way to make change by itself. Creating different ways of doing things. It's true and real, you can create an ombudsman, but those structural things that you talk about, you can research them, you can be ready, and in a way, the way social change through law takes place is that there's a kind of avant-garde of lawyers who see the issues, define the issues, and then comes a politics that says, we need to make change. And then they say, and they look around and they say, are there any lawyers on our team? Well, most lawyers represent the power of the old regime. So the lawyers who are thinking of the future become the new power lawyers of tomorrow. So I think doing that kind of work is very important.
Bom dia, professor. As reformas feitas no nosso país na última década, em relação ao acesso ao poder judiciário, tendem a gravitar em torno de 3 eixos fundamentais. Primeiro, de tornar a justiça mais barata. O segundo é no sentido de tornar a justiça mais célere, diminuindo a quantidade de recursos, por exemplo. E o terceiro é fazer com que os entendimentos judiciais sejam mais objetivos, no sentido de evitar posicionamentos conflitantes entre diferentes juízes e tribunais, através, por exemplo, de entendimentos vinculantes por parte dos tribunais superiores. Me parece que esses têm sido os eixos fundamentais dessas reformas. Por outro lado, sob a perspectiva nossa de defensores públicos, nós temos percebido que no campo da litigância civil, a litigância de massa normalmente gravita em torno de 3 núcleos fundamentais. Primeiro, núcleos relacionais, por exemplo, conflitos de família. O segundo, litigâncias contra o Estado, para o acesso a serviços públicos básicos, na área de saúde, de educação, moradia, transporte público. E o terceiro, normalmente se dá em litígios contra litigantes habituais, grandes empresas, especialmente bancos e empresas concessionárias de serviços públicos. As reformas, esses núcleos fundantes das reformas no Poder Judiciário, me parece que atuam muito mal diante dessas 3 realidades. Porque, se por um lado torna uma justiça mais barata, isso não é bom para os litigantes habituais, porque os conflitos contra bancos e grandes empresas deveriam se tornar conflitos mais caros para essas empresas, de forma a diminuir o potencial de conflito nas relações com consumidores, por exemplo. Por outro lado, tornar a justiça mais séria e mais imediata pode ser ruim para a resolução de conflitos familiares, na medida em que muitas vezes, por trás de um litígio de divórcio ou uma dissolução de uma relação de companheirismo, por exemplo, existe uma relação bastante particular que seria muito melhor gestada através de mecanismos como a mediação, de forma a solucionar pano de fundo de algumas controvérsias que aparecem episodicamente através de uma ou outra ação judicial. E no tocante aos conflitos contra o poder público, o ideal seria que a justiça não fosse tão acessível, para que os conflitos pudessem ser resolvidos extrajudicialmente e o judiciário não entrasse nessa relação. Diante desse sentimento de análise, o projeto Florença tem se debruçado sobre o conflito entre as perspectivas de reforma do judiciário e essas distintas realidades, porque talvez os projetos de reforma que nós tenhamos desenvolvido nas últimas décadas não sejam suficientes e talvez até estimulem uma resolução inadequada dessas controvérsias. Eu gostaria de ouvir o senhor um pouco a respeito.
Well, the first thing I would say is, yes, I agree exactly with your perspective from what I understand about recent developments in Brazil. And indeed, the FGV article that I posted makes a lot about these binding understandings in a way that makes sense to me, which is that before you make a binding understanding, you're allowed to consult with others. But of course, those who can consult the best are those with the most resources, and they can shape the binding understanding to be one that serves them in their repeat litigations on the same issue. So I absolutely agree, and I think the Florence Project provides, in a way, a nice framework still. In one way in particular, is that even though the world where there's a broad social commitment to making rights effective didn't happen and is not imminent, although we do have political changes that will come, but in every single case where there's an injustice, we can see the violation of access to justice. And we can see that the institutions have been shaped in ways that can be criticized very strongly from an access to justice perspective. So there's absolutely room for the project that you outline of thinking about it in those ways. What's sad or inevitable or just the way things are, I'm not sure, is that those who called the shots in those reforms were the efficiency minded. They were not the access to justice minded. And I don't know where the economists are in the current government, but up until this time at least, the efficiency language was very much dominant.
Bom dia, professor. A grande responsabilidade de fazer a última pergunta aqui, né, espero que seja boa. Sobre a perspectiva da defensoria pública, né, a gente percebe que muito se fala em acesso à justiça com o conceito de acesso ao judiciário, especificamente. E a gente consegue perceber que o acesso ao judiciário ele acaba se tornando ineficiente após um tempo. Então, as demandas individuais elas acabam não tendo tanta efetividade. Nós temos algumas demandas que são propostas e não são cumpridas diante do grande volume. E aí começamos a perceber que a atuação extrajudicial, como o Daniel falou, muitas vezes soluciona o conflito de uma forma muito mais eficaz. Especialmente quando a gente fala em poder público, o acesso para buscar serviços públicos. E aí percebemos também que a litigância estratégica, como a colega falou, ela também tem se tornado mais eficiente. Nós tivemos uma decisão paradigmática da nossa Suprema Corte aqui, que tratou sobre o nosso sistema penitenciário nacional, declarando que o estado de coisas era inconstitucional. Mas a gente percebe ainda que o judiciário não consegue muitas vezes dar vazão aos problemas e que nós temos uma declaração de uma inconstitucionalidade que não é resolvida pelo judiciário. E eu queria saber como, ao redor do globo, a gente tem essa resolução sem precisar demandar uma questão específica do judiciário e realmente conseguir a efetividade daquela demanda.
I'll answer a little bit indirectly, but it's a very good last question. When I started out as a teacher of civil procedure, the federal district courts in the United States were running the prisons. They were deciding where highways would be built. They were supervising the choices that were being made. They were, in effect, taking over labor unions and schools. And this was very much part of this activist agenda that was embedded in the courts. And it led to some affecting things, but it was completely, of course, unsustainable over time, because courts can't really be in the business of running institutions. They don't have the resources, etc. So it's always a problem, and there are others who know this better, but there always is a problem of the best Supreme Court, doesn't have an army, doesn't have an unlimited budget. And so I've done some work in India, and the Indian Supreme Court was extremely progressive. But they would make an order that certain polluting vehicles had to be off the road by next year. The next year would be next year, and the next year would be 10 years, and it just did not, there wasn't anything they could do. And so it's always the case that you hope for a kind of cultural respect for the Supreme Court, and mostly you get that. But there are for sure limits, which goes back to the same question, which is, it's judicializing doesn't necessarily get you where you want to go.